Get this garbage out of my sight. Who the hell let this person into my executive conference room? I am here for the capital restructuring review.
Get this garbage out of my sight. Who the hell let this person into my executive conference room? Garrison Vance did not raise his voice, but the venom in his tone made the entire room drop to a freezing absolute zero. Christian Blake stood perfectly still at the edge of the polished walnut table. He was holding a faded manila folder. "I am here for the capital restructuring review," Christian said. His voice was low, flat, completely devoid of fear. Garrison looked at Christian's shoes, then at his cheap gray suit, then finally at his face. "Shut your mouth," Garrison said, stepping forward until he was less than 2 feet away. "I don't care what you think you are here for. Look at you. You look like you belong in the basement, fixing the pipes, not standing on my imported carpet. Don't you dare look me in the eye." Christian did not look down. He kept his hands at his side. Garrison's upper lip curled into a sneer of pure disgust. "People like you always try to skip the line, trying to play a game you don't have the chips for," Garrison whispered, making sure every single one of the 11 board members heard every single syllable. "Get your hands off my table and get out before I have security throw you down the elevator shaft." Christian looked at the polished wood surface. He had barely touched it. He slowly lowered his gaze, picked up his folder, and pulled his hand back. Garrison Vance had just spat in the face of the only man in North America who could save his grandfather's empire from a federal liquidation order. Garrison just didn't know it yet. To understand exactly how a multi-billion-dollar corporation died in less than 90 days, we have to go back to how the morning actually started. Let's rewind the clock. Exactly 5 hours earlier, the south side of Chicago, Illinois. Inside a small brick row house on a street, where the street lights blinked twice before turning off entirely, Christian Blake was already awake. The walls were thin enough that he could hear the early morning freight train rumbling 3 miles away. The radiator in the corner gave a sharp, metallic clank every 11 minutes, like clockwork. Christian stood over a wooden ironing board that had been passed down from his mother. He was carefully pressing the seam of a dark gray suit. The iron hissed. A small cloud of steam rose past his dark face, dampening his forehead. He moved the iron, slow, deliberate, with the precise rhythm of a man who knew that when you have nothing but your dignity, you don't leave a single crease behind. The suit wasn't tailored. It wasn't wool or silk. He had purchased it from a Goodwill donation center on 79th Street for exactly $35.50. The hem on the right trouser leg had come loose 3 months ago, and Christian had sewn it back together himself using a black thread that didn't quite match. But it was clean. It was sharp. It was his. On his small kitchen table sat a worn leather briefcase with a brass latch that had lost its shine years ago. Inside that briefcase were 48 pages of financial diagnostics, debt-to-equity ratios, and a cash infusion term sheet addressed to Vance Infrastructure Group. Christian had spent the last 3 weeks analyzing their tax filings. He knew their hidden liabilities. He knew they were exactly 28 days away from a technical default on a $95 million municipal bond. Next to the briefcase sat a blue ceramic mug filled with black coffee, no sugar, and a small, cracked silver frame containing a black and white photograph. It was a picture of a younger Christian standing next to an elderly man in front of a small grocery store with a sign that read Blake's Provisions. The store had been burned down during a civil unrest event 30 years ago, and the city had refused to approve the insurance claim because of a technical zoning loophole. That photo was a permanent reminder of what happens when you don't understand the rules of the system. Christian finished his coffee in 3 long swallows, wiped the mug clean, and placed it upside down on the drying rack. He picked up the briefcase, checked his watch, and walked out into the freezing Chicago air. He walked 7 blocks to the nearest transit station, his shoes clicking against the frozen concrete. He caught the Red Line train heading north toward the Loop. The car was packed with night shift hospital janitors, warehouse workers, hotel maids, and security guards. Nobody spoke. The windows were fogged with the collective breath of 50 people trying to get to work before the city woke up. Christian sat in the corner seat, his briefcase resting flat on his knees. To anyone looking at him, he was just another anonymous face in the crowd, a working-class man in a cheap suit heading to a job that paid by the hour. He didn't look like power. He didn't look like money. He looked like the kind of man people looked right through. And that was exactly how Christian preferred it. The train pulled into the underground station beneath the financial district. Christian stepped off and walked 4 blocks east through the towering canyons of glass and steel until he reached the glass facade of the Vance Tower. 64 stories of reinforced concrete and dark-tinted windows. The lobby was an acre of white Italian marble and brushed titanium. A massive security desk sat in the center, flanked by turnstiles that required an encrypted biometric scan to pass. Christian walked up to the desk. The security guard, a middle-aged man with a silver badge named Miller, didn't look up from his computer screen for the first 10 seconds. Christian stood there, patient, motionless.
"Can I help you with something?"
Miller asked, his eyes finally drifting toward Christian's worn briefcase and the scuffed toes of his $35 shoes.
"I have an appointment with the chief financial officer," Christian said.
"My name is Christian Blake." Miller typed the name into his system, scrolled through the ledger, and then paused. His face didn't soften, but a slight look of confusion crossed his features. He didn't give Christian an executive visitor badge. Instead, he reached into a drawer, pulled out a laminated yellow pass, and pointed toward the service elevators behind the freight corridor.
"Take that elevator to the 52nd floor," Miller said, his voice dropping an octave.
"Don't use the main express cars. Those are for tenants only.
Wait in the corridor outside the mechanical room until somebody calls you."
Christian took the yellow pass.
He didn't complain.
He didn't mention that his investment group owned 40% of the land the tower was built on. He just nodded, walked down the narrow service hallway, and entered the metal-lined elevator. For the next 2.5 hours, Christian sat on a hard plastic chair next to a maintenance closet on the 52nd floor. The air smelled of industrial floor cleaner and hot engine oil from the HVAC units behind the wall. Executives in custom-made charcoal suits walked past the glass doors 20 feet away, laughing, holding premium coffee cups, talking about their weekend properties in Lake Geneva. Not a single person looked through the glass at the black man sitting on the plastic chair. The door to the service hallway opened and Arthur Pendleton stepped out. Arthur was the CFO of Vance Infrastructure Group. He was 62 years old, thin, with deep bags under his eyes and a hand that shook slightly as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses.
He looked at Christian, and his chest heaved with a massive sigh of relief.
"Mr. Blake," Arthur whispered, looking over his shoulder to ensure none of the junior associates were watching.
"Thank God you're here. I apologize for the seating arrangement."
"Mr. Vance has been in a terrible mood all morning. The quarterly numbers just came in from the auditors, and it's worse than we thought. If we don't get the signature on your institutional credit line by noon, the rating agencies are going to drop our paper to junk status before the market closes." Christian stood up, smoothed the front of his thrift store jacket, and picked up his briefcase. "Lead the way, Arthur," he said quietly. Arthur nodded quickly, wiped a bead of sweat from his upper lip, and led Christian through the heavy glass partition into the main executive wing. The hallway opened up into a massive boardroom, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling glass, that provided a panoramic view of the frozen Chicago River below. A 30-foot conference table, made of a single slab of black walnut, occupied the center of the room. 11 individuals were already seated around it, senior vice presidents, general counsels, and regional directors. They were typing on sleek laptops, adjusting their French cuffs, and sipping from crystal water tumblers. When Christian entered, the low hum of conversation stopped instantly. 11 pairs of eyes locked onto his cheap suit. A heavy, uncomfortable silence descended on the room. Arthur led Christian toward the far end of the table, his fingers trembling as he pulled out a leather chair that had been placed slightly away from the main cluster of board members. Before Christian could even sit down, the double doors at the head of the boardroom swung open with a sharp click. Garrison Vance walked in. He was 42 years old, over 6 feet tall, with a perfectly sculpted jawline and hair that looked like it had been styled by a professional 30 minutes ago. He wore a navy blue pinstripe suit that cost more than Christian's annual property taxes on his home in the South Side. His gold watch caught the morning sun as he threw a thick stack of reports onto the table. He didn't look at Arthur. He didn't look at the board members. His eyes locked instantly onto Christian Blake, like a hawk spotting a field mouse on a clean lawn. He stopped in his tracks, his shoulders tightening, his nostrils flaring with immediate, unadulterated hostility.
Which brings us back to the exact moment the fuse was lit.
Garrison Vance took 3 long, deliberate steps until he was standing directly in front of Christian.
What the hell is this? Who let this person into my executive conference room?
Garrison asked, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. Arthur Pendleton jumped up so fast his chair nearly tipped backward.
Mr. Vance, this is the principal from
Blake Global Partners, Arthur stammered, his face turning the color of old chalk. This is the investor we talked about. The one who is reviewing our emergency liquidity facility. Garrison didn't look at Arthur. He kept his eyes fixed on Christian's face, his lip curling further. I don't give a damn what Arthur told you, Garrison said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, venomed whisper. Look at this man, Arthur. Look at his suit. Look at his skin.
You brought a street hustler into my grandfather's boardroom to save my company?
Christian didn't flinch. He didn't raise his hands to defend himself.
He simply stood there, holding his leather briefcase, his eyes steady and deep.
Mr. Vance, your company is facing a technical default on $95 million of municipal bonds in exactly 28 days, Christian said, his voice calm, clear, and perfectly measured. I have the 48-page diagnostic report right here. If you will allow me to present the restructuring terms.
Garrison didn't let him finish.
With a violent, sweeping motion of his arm, he struck the manila folder out of Christian's hand. The brass latch on the old briefcase popped open, and 48 pages of white paper scattered across the polished walnut table and drifted onto the floor, sliding across the dark wood like broken glass.
I said, "Shut your mouth!"
Garrison roared, his face turning an ugly, mottled red. I don't need a lecture on my finances from someone who looks like they crawled out of a South Side basement. You people come in here with your corporate jargon and your diversity passes, thinking you can sit at the big table.
You don't belong here.
This building was built by men who worked, men who had bloodlines, men who looked like me. You are nothing but a diversity hire's bad dream. Get these papers off my table, pick them up off my floor, and get out before I have my security team physically drag you through the lobby so everyone can see what a fraud you are. The 11 board members sat frozen in their leather chairs.
Not one of them moved.
Not one of them looked at Christian.
They looked down at their laptops. They looked at their gold pens.
They looked anywhere but at the blatant cruelty unfolding 3 feet away from them. Christian looked down at the scattered papers on the floor. He didn't look angry. He didn't look humiliated. He looked like a scientist watching an experiment behave exactly as he had predicted. He slowly knelt down on one knee, his cheap trousers straining against the fabric. One by one, he picked up the white sheets of paper from the carpet.
He didn't rush.
He smoothed the edges of each page with his wide, calloused palm, stacking them in a neat pile. No one helped him. Arthur Pendleton stood there, his hands pressed against his sides, his eyes filled with a terrifying mixture of shame and fear, but he didn't lean down.
He didn't help the man who had come to save his life.
Christian stood back up, placed the stacked documents inside his briefcase, and snapped the broken brass latch shut with a hollow click. "Are you finished playing the victim?" Garrison asked, crossing his arms over his pinstriped chest, a smug, self-righteous smirk returning to his lips. "Because real men have actual work to do. This room is for people who create wealth, not people who look for handouts." Christian looked Garrison Vance dead in the eye for 3 long seconds. The silence in the room was so heavy that the hum of the ventilation system sounded like a jet engine.
"Yes, Mr.
"Vance," Christian said, his voice softer than it had been before, but carrying a weight that made Arthur Pendleton's stomach turn completely over. "I believe I am finished." Christian turned on his heel and walked toward the double-glass doors. His shoes made no sound on the thick carpet. He pushed the door open, stepped into the executive hallway, and left the room without looking back. Garrison Vance let out a short, harsh laugh, turned back to the table, and shook his head.
"Where were we, gentlemen?"
"Arthur, pull up the secondary credit market sheets. Let's talk about real money, not these street rats." The 11 board members immediately opened their files, their voices returning in a nervous, hurried chatter, pretending they hadn't just witnessed a human being stripped of his dignity because of the color of his skin. Meanwhile, Christian Blake walked down the service corridor and entered the elevator. The metal doors closed, cutting off the sound of the 52nd floor. The elevator descended in complete silence. Christian pulled a cheap, cracked smartphone from his jacket pocket and pressed a single speed dial button. It rang exactly 1 time before a sharp professional voice answered on the other end.
"This is David," the voice said. "How did the Vance meeting go, boss?"
Christian watched the floor indicator numbers count down on the small LED screen above the door. "Pull everything," Christian said.
2 words, no emotion, no hesitation.
David paused on the other end for half a second. "You mean the entire institutional allocation? The 95 million bond purchase and the 105 million warehouse line? All of it," Christian said. "Transfer the entire $200 million facility to Miller Maritime Corp immediately. I want the Vance account completely cleared out of our registry before I hit the street." "Considered it done," David replied. The line went dead. The elevator reached the lobby with a soft chime. Christian stepped out into the white marble lobby. He walked past the massive security desk, where Miller was still sitting. Miller didn't look up. Christian walked through the heavy rotating glass doors and stepped out onto the Chicago sidewalk. The morning sun was bright, reflecting off the icy surface of the river. Taxis were honking, delivery trucks were unloading, and thousands of people in heavy coats were rushing to their offices. Christian turned the corner and disappeared into the crowd.
Just another anonymous black man in a cheap suit. Nobody noticed him.
Nobody looked twice. But $200 million had just vanished from the balance sheet of Vance Infrastructure Group, and Garrison Vance was about to find out exactly what that meant. Back on the 52nd floor, Arthur Pendleton excused himself from the boardroom, walked into the executive restroom, and locked the door behind him. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely turn the faucet. He splashed ice-cold water onto his face, leaning over the marble sink, his chest heaving. He looked at himself in the mirror.
He had sat there.
He had watched it happen. He had let his boss talk to Christian Blake like he was an animal, and now the company was dead.
Because Arthur knew what Garrison didn't.
Christian Blake wasn't a broker. He wasn't a middleman. He was the sole owner and chief investment officer of Blake Global Partners, a private equity firm that held over $8 billion in liquid assets. He was the only man who had agreed to buy the distressed municipal bonds that were keeping the Vance Tower from foreclosure. Arthur dried his hands with a paper towel, his mind racing. He should go back into the room and tell Garrison the truth. He should tell him that the man he just kicked out of the building was the billionaire who held their entire future in his briefcase.
But fear was a powerful paralyzer.
If he told Garrison now, Garrison would blame him. Garrison would fire him on the spot. So Arthur straightened his tie, opened the restroom door, walked back into the boardroom, sat down in his leather chair, and chose the easiest path available to a coward. He said absolutely nothing.
2 weeks flew by.
In those 14 days, Garrison Vance didn't think about the man in the cheap gray suit a single time. He didn't ask Arthur who he was. He didn't review the manila folder that had been thrown on the floor, and he didn't care. To Garrison, that encounter was completely irrelevant, a minor annoyance that had been handled with the appropriate level of executive authority. He returned to his comfortable, high-priced routine. Morning espresso at 8 a.m., lunch at his private club on Michigan Avenue, where the membership fee was $50,000 a year, and afternoon golf sessions with city officials who always let him win because they wanted his company's campaign contributions. His life was perfect. His empire was secure until the clock ran out. On the 15th morning after the boardroom incident, the first pillar of the temple crumbled. It happened early in the morning.
Arthur Pendleton was sitting at his desk, staring at his monitor, his coffee going cold in his mug.
An email had just arrived from the Illinois Municipal Regulatory Commission.
The text was short, cold, and legally absolute.
Due to the failure of Vance Infrastructure Group to secure an institutional anchor buyer for the Series B restructuring bonds by the mandatory deadline of 5 p.m. yesterday, the Commission has officially triggered the non-compliance clause. The $95 million bond issue has been canceled. The credit rating for Vance Infrastructure Group has been downgraded to D-grade.
Default status.
All municipal contracts currently active are under immediate review for termination. Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. His stomach tightened into a hard, painful knot. He didn't even bother to print the email. He stood up, his legs feeling like lead, walked down the executive corridor, and entered Garrison Vance's office without knocking. Garrison was sitting behind his mahogany desk, talking on a sleek phone, laughing loudly about a penthouse property in Miami. He looked up, his brow furrowing at Arthur's sudden intrusion.
"Hang on a second,"
Garrison said into the phone, lowering it to his desk. "Arthur, what the hell is wrong with you? Don't you know how to knock?"
"The bonds," Arthur whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood.
"They're gone, Mr. Vance. The state just canceled the issue. We are in technical default as of 5 minutes ago."
Garrison's laugh died instantly.
The color didn't leave his face all at once. It faded in slow, erratic patches, leaving his skin looking gray and mottled. "What do you mean canceled?"
Garrison hissed, slamming his phone onto the desk. "We had a commitment from Blake Global Partners."
Arthur shook his head, his eyes staring down at the expensive oriental rug. "They pulled out, sir."
"They pulled their entire institutional capital pool 2 weeks ago."
"They transferred the funds to Miller Maritime within an hour of leaving this building." Garrison stood up, his chair rolling back until it hit the glass wall behind him. "Then get them back on the phone. Call their office. Threaten them with a breach of contract lawsuit." "I don't care what you have to do, Arthur. Fix this." Arthur looked up, and for the first time in 15 years, there was no fear in his eyes, only a cold, dead despair. "I can't fix it, Mr. Vance," Arthur said quietly. "I've tried calling their main line 9 times this morning. Their managing director told me that Blake Global Partners does not negotiate with bankrupt entities."
And then he hung up on me.
By noon that day, The second domino fell with a thunderous crash. The Chicago Transit Authority issued a public press release stating that due to the financial instability of Vance Infrastructure Group, the $85 million rail expansion contract had been pulled and re-awarded to Miller Maritime Corp. By 3 p.m., two more major institutional lenders called to accelerate their short-term loans, demanding full repayment of $45 million within 48 hours. The company was bleeding to death in plain sight. Garrison Vance didn't know how to handle a world that didn't obey his commands. He lost his temper completely. He screamed at his vice presidents. He threw heavy crystal paperweights through the glass partitions of his office. And he hired 3 separate high-priced corporate litigation law firms to file emergency injunctions against the state. But by 5 p.m., all 3 law firms called back with the same devastating news. The terms of the municipal bond contract were ironclad. Non-compliance was absolute. There was no legal remedy. The professional equivalent of trying to stop a bullet with a luxury watch. Within another 7 days, the physical damage began to show on the streets. Work stopped on 4 major construction sites across the city of Chicago. Tower cranes sat idle against the gray sky, concrete trucks were turned away at the gates, and 300 construction workers were told that their health insurance benefits had been frozen due to a non-payment of premiums by the parent company. These were working-class men and women, people who had nothing to do with the arrogance in the 52nd floor boardroom, people who had families to feed and mortgages to pay. They stood outside the locked gates in the freezing rain, holding their lunchboxes, their faces filled with confusion and anger, while security guards watched them through the chain-link fences. Garrison Vance tried to control the narrative. He called a mandatory all-hands meeting in the main atrium of the building. He stood on a raised platform, wearing a pristine Italian wool suit, his gold watch gleaming under the bright lights, and told the remaining 500 corporate staff members that the current situation was merely a temporary market correction caused by political interference from the city council. He promised them that their jobs were secure and that a new financing round was being finalized with an international consortium. Nobody believed him. The employees looked at his expensive suit, they looked at his polished shoes, and then they looked at each other. They knew the truth. They could smell the rot from the top. By the end of the month, the clients were fleeing like passengers off a sinking ship. The logistics, accounts, the concrete supply contracts, the engineering consultations, over $120 million in annual revenue vanished from the ledger in less than 30 days. The stock price of Vance Infrastructure Group dropped from $45 a share to exactly $3.12, turning the company's equity into worthless paper. The board of directors, who had sat in silent compliance for years while Garrison used the company as his personal piggy bank, finally realized that their own personal fortunes were at risk. Catherine Vance Ellis, Garrison's aunt, and the chairwoman of the family trust, called an emergency closed-door meeting. Attendance was mandatory, no proxies allowed. Garrison walked into the boardroom, expecting to take control of the room, as he always did. He had spent an hour practicing his speech, adjusting his silk tie in his private mirror, building a presentation about structural resilience. He pushed open the heavy double walnut doors. The same room, the same 30-foot table, the same 11 chairs, but when he stepped inside, no one stood up, no one nodded, no one even looked at him. 11 pairs of eyes were fixed on the flat-screen monitor mounted on the far wall. Projecting in crisp, high-definition digital text across the entire width of the boardroom was a national financial press release that had gone live earlier that morning. At the top of the page was the clean blue logo of Blake Global Partners, and directly beneath the logo was a large, full-color corporate headshot of a man. He was wearing a modest dark gray suit, The exact same suit with the slightly mismatched black thread on the trouser hem. His face was calm, steady, his dark eyes looking directly into the lens with an unshakable, quiet authority. The text beneath the photo read, Christian Blake, founder and chief executive officer, Blake Global Partners. Garrison Vance's knees buckled. His brain sent the signal to take another step forward, but his legs simply refused to cooperate. He stood frozen in the doorway, his briefcase slipping from his fingers and hitting the carpet with a dull thud. The man in the photograph was the man he had called an animal. The man he had told to pick up papers off his floor. The man whose hand he had refused to shake in front of 11 witnesses. Garrison stared at the screen, his mouth opening slightly, but his throat was so dry that no sound came out. Catherine Vance Ellis turned her chair to face him. Her face didn't hold any anger. It held a cold, dead finality that was far more terrifying. "Sit down, Garrison," she said. Garrison slid into the nearest chair, his hands trembling so violently he had to hide them beneath the walnut table. Catherine pressed a button on her remote control, scrolling down the digital press release to highlight a specific section. Blake Global Partners has officially finalized a $350 million cash infusion and equity purchase of Miller Maritime Corp., she read aloud, her voice steady and hollow. The acquisition effectively consolidates 80% of all municipal infrastructure development in the state of Illinois under the direct control of Mr. Blake. Christian Blake didn't just pull his funding from us, Garrison. He redirected every single dollar to our biggest competitor, and then he added another $150 million on top of it to buy out our lease options on the riverfront terminals. Catherine scrolled further down, opening the biographical appendix attached to the press release. Christian Blake. Born and raised in the Englewood neighborhood of Chicago. His father was a factory worker who lost his job when the plant closed down. His mother was a school cook. Christian worked 28 hours a week at a local tire repair shop while maintaining a perfect 4.0 grade point average at his local high school. He earned a full academic scholarship to the University of Chicago, graduating summa cum laude in economics, before completing his Master of Business Administration at Harvard Business School on a full fellowship. He founded Blake Global Partners at the age of 32 in a rented basement office with less than $15,000 in personal savings. Within 20 years, the firm grew to manage over $8 billion in sovereign wealth funds and institutional capital. Christian Blake's personal net worth was currently valued at $114 billion. He was a member of the board of trustees for 3 major hospitals, had funded 9 community centers across the South Side, and had been featured on the Forbes Billionaires list for 6 consecutive years. The man Garrison had told to go fix the pipes in the basement was one of the most powerful financial forces in the Midwest. The boardroom was so quiet that the ticking of the wall clock 3 rooms away could be heard through the insulation. Catherine turned back to Garrison, her eyes drilling into his chest. "You threw a billionaire out of this room, Garrison. A man who came here in good faith to save our family's legacy. You insulted his clothing. You insulted his background. You refused to shake his hand because of the color of his skin." Garrison's lips moved, dry and white. I didn't know," he whispered, his voice cracking. "How was I supposed to know? He looked like. He didn't even have a tailored suit. He looks like what, Garrison?" Catherine cut him off, her voice like ice. "He looks like a man who doesn't need to show off his money to people like you." Thomas Miller, the general counsel for the firm, spoke up next from the far side of the table. His voice was precise, professional, the tone of an attorney, who knew that every word was being recorded for a bankruptcy filing. "Mr. Vance, the press release includes an official statement from Mr. Blake's legal team. It is exactly 10 words long." Thomas adjusted his glasses and read directly from his screen. We do not invest capital where human dignity is not respected. 10 words, Garrison. No anger. No legal threats. No vulgarity. Just a clean, devastating statement that has already been picked up by Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal. By tomorrow morning, every institutional investor in the world will know exactly why this company went under. Garrison Vance looked back at the photograph of Christian Blake on the wall. The calm, dark eyes seemed to look right through him, seeing every insecurity, every piece of fake pride, every ounce of unearned privilege that Garrison had built his life upon. Christian Blake hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't made a scene. He had simply let the system take care of the rest. Because Christian Blake didn't need to prove anything to anyone in this room. He never did. Catherine Vance Ellis stood up, gathering her leather files into a neat stack. The board will reconvene on Monday morning to file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, she said, looking down at her nephew with pure disgust. In the meantime, Garrison, you are officially stripped of your title as Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately. Your equity shares are frozen pending an investigation into corporate mismanagement. I suggest you find personal legal counsel, because the family trust will not spend a single dollar to defend you from the shareholder lawsuits that are coming. She turned and walked out of the room. One by one, the remaining 10 board members stood up and followed her. Not a single person shook Garrison's hand. Not a single person said goodbye. Arthur Pendleton was the last one at the door. He paused, his hand on the heavy brass handle, and looked back at Garrison sitting alone at the head of the massive walnut table. Garrison looked smaller now, his shoulders hunched, his navy blue suit looking too big for his frame. Arthur wanted to say something, wanted to tell him that he was sorry, wanted to tell him that he should have spoken up 2 weeks ago. But he didn't. He flipped the light switch, plunging the boardroom into darkness except for the digital glow of the press release on the wall, and closed the heavy walnut door with a soft, final click. While Garrison Vance sat alone in the dark, 3 miles away in a high-rise office on Park Avenue, Christian Blake was putting on his modest winter coat. His assistant, a young black woman named Elena, entered the room with a thick stack of media requests from television networks and national newspapers. "Mr. Blake, everyone wants a live interview," she said. "They want you to talk about the Vance case." Christian picked up his briefcase, the same one with the broken brass latch, and shook his head gently. "Tell them no, Elena," Christian said. "The numbers have already spoken. They don't need my help." He walked out of the office and entered the evening air. The Chicago streets were illuminated by the yellow glow of the streetlights, reflecting off the wet pavement. A light snow had begun to fall, drifting down between the skyscrapers. Christian walked down the sidewalk alone. He didn't have a private security detail. He didn't have a limousine waiting for him at the curb, and he didn't have an entourage. He walked 4 blocks to the transit station, slipped his transit card into the turnstile, and boarded the Red Line train heading south back to his neighborhood. He sat down in the corner seat, pulled his collar up against the cold, and closed his eyes. To the other passengers in the car, he was just another working-class man heading home after a long day. Nobody knew his name. Nobody knew his net worth. And that was exactly how he wanted it. Over the next 60 days, the investigation into Vance Infrastructure Group turned into a national corporate scandal. Andrea Collins, an investigative journalist for the Chicago Financial Register, refused to let the story die. She had received an anonymous tip containing a 38-second audio recording from that fateful boardroom meeting. One of the board members had left their phone face down on the walnut table with the voice recorder active to take personal minutes. The audio was crystal clear. Garrison Vance's voice echoed across every news channel in America. "Who let this animal into my boardroom? Don't you dare touch me with those hands. You people disgust me." The public reaction was immediate and furious. Lenders withdrew their capital, city contracts across 3 states were canceled, and protests organized by local labor unions shut down the company's remaining offices. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission launched a formal investigation into the firm's historical hiring practices. What federal investigators found inside the digital archives of the company was a horror show of systemic discrimination. Emails from Garrison Vance to the HR department explicit in their instructions: keep the client-facing teams looking professional, no Southside hires. Memos directing managers to prioritize cultural fit over technical qualifications when reviewing minority candidates. The federal report was 64 pages long, and it used the term intentional systemic bias on every single page. Christian Blake filed a personal civil suit against Garrison Vance for intentional infliction of emotional distress and racial discrimination. The trial took place in the federal courthouse downtown. Christian took the stand on the 3rd day. He wore the exact same $35 gray suit he had worn to the boardroom. The opposing attorney asked him why a man of his immense wealth would choose to wear such a cheap garment to a federal court. Christian looked at the jury, his voice calm and resonant. Because a human being's value is not determined by the price tag on his jacket, Christian said, I wanted the court to see exactly what Garrison Vance saw, and then I wanted them to decide if that treatment was justified. The jury foreman later wrote that the entire trial ended in that exact second. Garrison Vance took the stand on day 7. His high-priced defense attorneys tried to frame his comments as a momentary lapse in judgment caused by professional stress and extreme financial pressure. But the prosecution played the 38-second audio recording through the courtroom speakers. Garrison had to sit on the wooden witness stand and listen to his own cruel, venomed voice echo off the marble walls 4 times in a row. He couldn't take the words back. He couldn't claim he was misquoted. He sat there, his face drained of all color, his hands gripping the wooden railing until his knuckles turned white, staring down at his shoes. The jury deliberated for exactly 1 hour and 45 minutes. Guilty on all counts, Garrison Vance was ordered to pay $5 million in personal damages to Christian Blake. The company was liquidated 3 weeks later under a federal bankruptcy court order. The assets were sold off at auction for pennies on the dollar. Miller Maritime Corp. Purchased the heavy equipment, the riverfront leases, and the contracts, immediately rehiring the 300 construction workers who had been laid off, restoring their full healthcare benefits and increasing their hourly wages by 15%. The Vance Tower was sold to an institutional real estate trust, and the name Vance was stripped from the stone facade with air hammers, leaving nothing but an empty gray scar where the gold letters used to sit. Douglas Crane, who had taken over as the liquidating agent for the remaining shell company, issued a public letter of apology to Christian Blake on behalf of the former management team. He admitted his own cowardice, his own choice of silence over courage on the morning of the meeting. Christian never replied publicly to the letter, but 3 weeks later, Douglas received a plain white envelope in his mail. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 4 handwritten words in black ink. It takes time. Courage. Signed, CB 6 months later. A crisp Saturday morning in October, the south side of Chicago. The leaves on the oak trees along 79th Street had turned the color of burnt copper and gold. The air was cool and clean, carrying the smell of wet leaves and fresh coffee from a local bakery. Christian Blake was sitting at a simple plastic folding table inside a newly renovated community center. The Harold Moore Center for Entrepreneurship, funded entirely by an anonymous donation from Blake Global Partners. The floors were simple concrete, the chairs were cheap plastic, and the coffee came from a metal urn in the corner. Sitting in a large circle around him were 24 young minority entrepreneurs, college students, mechanics, single mothers, and young engineers. They had their notebooks open, their phones turned off, and their eyes locked onto Christian's face.
He wasn't giving a lecture.
He wasn't showing a slide deck. He was just talking to them, his voice low and warm, sharing the rules of a game he had spent 40 years mastering. The world will always try to tell you who you are, based on how you dress, where you live, or the color of your skin, Christian said, taking a slow sip from his paper cup.
Let them.
Let them waste their time measuring you while you spend your time building something they can't ignore. Outside on the brick wall of the building, a small bronze plaque caught the morning sun.
It read,
"Founded to prove that where you start does not dictate where you finish." There were no news cameras, no politicians, and no press releases. Christian didn't want the attention.
He wanted the results.
And 300 miles away in a small town in rural Illinois, inside a small rented house with peeling white paint on the window frames, Garrison Vance sat alone at a laminate kitchen table.
He had no company, no title,
No leather chair, and no gold watch. It had been sold to pay his legal fees. He was holding a financial magazine with Christian Blake's face on the cover under the headline, "The Quiet Billionaire. How True to Power Moves." Garrison closed the magazine, looked out the window at the empty, silent street, and finally understood the truth. Christian Blake hadn't destroyed his life. Garrison had destroyed it himself, and Christian had simply stopped standing in the way of the consequences. If this story opened your eyes to how quickly unearned privilege can shatter when confronting true integrity, leave a comment right below.
What would you have done if you were sitting at that walnut table?
Would you have spoken up, or would fear have kept you silent? If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, smash that button right now, because the next investigation runs even deeper, and you absolutely cannot afford to miss it. Share this narrative with someone who needs a reminder that dignity isn't a commodity you can buy. It's who you are when no one else is watching. The most lethal presence in any executive suite is the person who has absolutely nothing left to prove to you.
Keep that locked in your mind.